So good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Outsider Book Arts, Contemporary and Historical Approaches to Alternative Publishing Practices, the first session on the final day of the 2021 Contemporary Artist Book Conference. Surprisingly, I don't know about anyone else, I think I'm just about as exhausted as I normally am on a Sunday morning of the fair. And perhaps almost as bleary-eyed, although sadly not for all the same reasons as in years when we were all meeting in person in PS1. I'm David Solo, and as a member of the organizing committee of the conference, along with Karina Reynolds, will act as hosts for this session. The CABC has been held since 2008, and this year is organized by the Center for Book Arts as part of the Printed Matter Virtual Art Book Fair. If anyone hasn't had a chance to take a look around the fair, they've done a really great job. And so I encourage you to do so during the rest of the day. We would like to thank the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts for their generous support of the Center for Book Arts Book Art Review Criticism Initiative, including support for this conference, and to our conference sponsors, the Brooklyn Rail, Sorted Library, and Small Editions. We also want to acknowledge that the Center for Book Arts and the usual in-person venue for the conference are on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape peoples. The conference includes 10 sessions overall, wrapping up later today, exploring a wide range of questions about artist book criticism, what it is now, and what it can and might be. We've also held 2 convening sessions as part of the Book Art Review Initiative to explore specific questions and come up with ideas about critical frameworks. And we'll be concluding the conference at 4:30 p.m. this afternoon, Eastern Time, with an informal conversation about what we've heard, overall impressions, and anything else anyone might think of. In addition to the Zoom meetings, the sessions are also being live streamed on the Printed Matter Virtual Art Book Fair programs page under the CABC tab, and will be recorded and posted after the conference. If you have any questions during the session, please post them in the chat window, and as hosts, we'll be asking them on your behalf to the panelists. Attendees will be muted throughout. We recommend you also keep your cameras turned off. Feel free to chat during the session, and please remain respectful of the speakers and other attendees. We will be posting links during the talks, and if you have interesting things to share, feel free to do so as well. If you need any assistance during the session, please send a private message to anyone with CABC in their name. We will also, at the conclusion, keep the window and chat session open for a little bit longer in case people want to continue to talk. And so now I would like to introduce the moderator of this session. Meghan Forbes is a postdoctoral fellow in the Leonard A. Lauder Research Center for Modern Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Meghan's writings have appeared widely in publications such as Art Margins, Hyperallergic, LitHub, and Post:*Notes on art in a global context. She has also contributed to monographs and exhibition catalogs on the artists Alice Trumbull Mason, Toyen, and Vladislav Strumensky. Meghan is the sole editor of International Perspectives on Publishing Platforms, Image, Object, Text, Routledge 2019, and co-curator of Bauhaus Fukudamas Intersecting Parallels, Museum of Modern Art Library 2018. She is the founder and co-editor of Harlequin Creature, a not-for-profit arts and literary imprint of handmade books and magazines established in 2011. And so, Meghan, it's now all yours, and thank you.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you, Karina, and thank you for the Center for Book Arts for hosting this conference and inviting us to participate. It's my pleasure, before I get into my own talk, to introduce the other 2 panelists with whom we all together organized this panel. First up, after my presentation, will be Sherese Francis, who is a Queen-based Afro-Caribbean American, Barbados and Dominica poet, editor, interdisciplinary artist, workshop facilitator, and literary curator of the mobile library project J Expressions. She has published work in various publications, including Furious Flower, Obsidian Lit, Writwork Journal, Spoken Black Girl, The Operating System, Cosmonauts Avenue, No Dear, Apex Magazine, Bone Bouquet, African Voices, Newton Literary, and Free Verse. Additionally, she has published 2 chapbooks, Lucy's Bone Scrolls and Variations on Settling Seedling, and has another one on the way from Double Cross Press called Recycling a Y, that rules over my sacred site. Besides her publications, she has had work featured in exhibitions from the Lit Exhibit, New York Live Arts, Queens Public Library, and Baxter Street Camera Club. So, welcome, Sherese, and looking forward to hearing from you in a bit. And then following Sherese, we have Christina Long. Black Girls World Press is an award-winning indie publishing house based in New York City, led by Christina Long, MFA, Global Creative Director, and her younger sister Courtney Long, Senior Editor, since 2013. The press celebrates and documents Black women-X and women-X of color who participate in heavy music genres like metalcore, hardcore, punk, and black metal. Interviewing bands, reviewing music events, and vending at zine fairs allow Black Girls World Zine to introduce readers to new music and the diversity within music scenes. Zines and artist books published by Black Girls World can be found in libraries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Museum of Modern Art PS1, the Whitney Museum, the Schomburg Center for Research on Black Culture, the Barnard Zine Library, Reparations Club, and many more. So welcome also to Christina. And now I will dive into my presentation and share my screen. Okay. So first of all, I would just like to acknowledge Beyond the Center for Book Arts, also a couple of museums in New York, MoMA and the Met, which are institutions that have enabled this research on non-institutional materials. And I'd also like to acknowledge that a portion of this presentation was first discussed in a more public setting just about a year ago at the Artful Research Center in Budapest, which was itself once an underground archive of alternative publications and is now under the auspices of the Museum of Fine Arts in Budapest. So this talk will briefly introduce a series of underground publications produced in East Germany in the 1980s. For the context of this panel on alternative publishing practices, I will discuss in particular the ways in which they were produced and collected in the period under communism when there was little to no institutional state support available for such initiatives. The hodgepodge, DIY, and interdisciplinary approach of the underground art world in East Germany is a common aspect reflected in the look and content of many of its publications. A single issue of one of these magazines might include poetry, photographic documentation, advertisements, and exhibition reviews, thus evidencing the place of these magazines and their creators within this vibrant scene, and also serving as invaluable documentation, a contained archival unit, for anyone conducting research on it today. I will consider here how the publications have functioned as an archive of a particular cultural moment in the German Democratic Republic, or GDR, providing contemporary scholars, curators, and artists with evidence of a vibrant artistic scene that has nevertheless been largely written out of histories of German art in the 20th century, with the exception of such scholars as Christoph Tannert and Sarah Blaylock and the curator Susanne Altmann. Otherwise, histories of German art tend to privilege West Germany and its capitalist modes of production. These publications, fascinating objects in their own right, also comprise now a time capsule for the East German art scene as it was playing out. These publications, which were produced in cities across East Germany, which include Berlin, Dresden, Halle, and Leipzig, are an in situ representation of their moment and locale. The energy of the GDR's final decade is captured in these underground periodicals, which incorporate a wide assortment of materials, from twine and foil to high-quality printing paper, and employ diverse print methods, including typewriting, silkscreen, and lithography, as well as binding methods, from Japanese bindings to staples and brads. And they're all operated outside of the larger field of state-supported art production and publishing houses in the GDR. This photograph, found inside the 1986 issue of Anschlag, taken by Karen Wieghorst, is an excellent example of how the underground publication might function today as an archive. It was taken at the event Intermedia 1, a 2-day multimedia happening in the town of Coswig on June 1st and June 2nd, 1985. The photograph is both a compelling contribution to an alternative handmade magazine and useful documentation of an important event in the history of underground art in the GDR. If we manage to let our eyes wander past this intriguing punk romance taking place in the foreground, we see hanging in the background of behind the photograph's protagonists, a collection of painted rolos. These are window shades, which were a popular painting surface in the GDR because the cheap household objects could easily be stored and discreetly transported to avoid state censorship and possible confiscation. In this photograph by Volker Jager, we have a better sense of the size of the venue and crowd and can see another set of hanging rolos. This photograph appeared in a different publication, itself titled Intermedia, like the event, ultimately doubling as a sort of catalog for the two-day happening. And an advertisement for the event that also later appeared in this publication informs that there were more than 40 of these painted rolos installed in Kosvik, and that there were also performances of jazz, hard pop, dance and projections, and Musikbrigade concerts. Additionally, at the back of the publication, there's an envelope containing 17 black and white photographs of the installed rolos and a list of the artists who participated. And one of these photographs identifies Andreas Hegewald as the artist of the rolo that appeared prominently in the Vikhorst photograph with which I opened. Thus, again, these underground publications come to represent an archive within the archive, inasmuch as they hold space for a history of the punk art scene in the GDR of the 1980s and also are themselves held in library collections today. Already in 1986, the librarian Helga Sauer was able to acquire for the Saxon State and University Library, SLUB, alternative little magazines made by artists in the GDR, and she would later record in an issue of the library's newsletter in 1991, just a couple years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, how and why she was able to do this from within a state institution. She describes that although the magazines from the early 1980s appeared in tiny editions of typically no more than 20 copies, and that they had little visibility, by the time she began to collect them, quote, the artists sought out attention. They sought out confrontation with a wider public and with the art critic, end quote. This relationship between the librarian with an institutional position and artists working outside of institutional frameworks somewhat complicates predominating Western capitalist notions of collaboration and censorship under communism, and highlights the essential role of individual choices made within purportedly rigid structures of control. However, it's also important to briefly note here that the Stasi was aware of the collection and mandated that the director of the library place limits on its accessibility, as Sauer would later describe. In the library newsletter, Sauer underscored that these magazines operated independent of the censor, thanks to their underground, non-commercial nature, but likewise that, quote, in the cultural policy of the GDR, such an artist's exchange of material for publication outside state surveillance was not ordained and thus was regarded as subversive, end quote. Thus, these publications collectively represent one aspect of an art scene in East Germany that managed to exist outside of state-supported structures and remain relatively unhindered. With the time I have left, I would like to briefly present the alternative publications of the GDR in conversation with that physical space in which they might hopefully come to be stored and then accessed by a larger public, and address the essential role that the archive, library, museum, and similar such institutions play in the facilitation or obfuscation of a cultural history that printed matter helps construct. And when we think of the case of Sauer, for instance, it is of course essential to consider the people who do this work, that is, the archivists, librarians, catalogers, and other staff who are an incredibly important and yet somehow so often overlooked agent in this knowledge production. In this moment, when an invocation of the archive is a popular catchword for many things, it is also important to specify what archives we are talking about and in what context. As Sven Spiker has written in The Big Archive, already in the late 20th century, quote, the archive became the trope of choice for a dazzling variety of activities, end quote. In the introduction to Lost and Living in Archives, Annette Decker goes so far as to surmise, quote, "It could be stated that today everything is an archive and everyone an archivist," end quote. The word archive can conjure the large and federally controlled buildings of a given government, or a carefully kept catalog of items belonging to a single person, or something in between. Here in New York, the Lesbian Herstory Archive and Interference Archive offer but two examples of grassroots archives that do the work of addressing gaps in institutional archives and creating space for underrepresented stories to be heard and upheld. With all the will to archive as a tool in preserving such histories, it is also, however, worth mentioning here the risk inherent in a fetishization of the archive that elides its own limits. Diana Taylor, in making a distinction between the archive as enduring materials and repertoire as embodied practice or knowledge, cautions that what is ephemeral and thus challenging to archive, such as performance, poses a problem that is profoundly political. She asks, whose memories, traditions, and claims to history disappear if performance practices lack the staying power to transmit vital knowledge, and thus whose memories disappear if only archival knowledge is validized and granted permanence. I see in the alternative magazines of the GDR a practice of self-archiving, precisely of performance practices that resist a wholesale disappearance of the East German art scene. The creators of these publications clearly had access to certain materials to make this possible, such as a camera and film, even as the publications themselves showcase a practice of working with scarcity. But following Taylor, who's focusing on indigenous performance in Latin America, it is important to consider how this memory production might be limited or wholly suppressed in a variety of contexts, and what we miss if we only look to the archive. But in the case of these artists working in the GDR, through an innovative practice to create these DIY objects, there does now exist today an archival trace that begs further attention. Some of the earliest publications collected by Sauer for the Sloob, such as und, and Werte Oder, first published in 1981 and 1982 respectively, as well as later ones such as Und so weiter, were all essentially assemblings. Zana Gilbert, in the context of mail art networks between Latin America and Europe, defines the assembled magazine as, quote, a publication for which artists send the entire run of their contribution to a coordinator, who is then responsible for its distribution. Often, assemblings were unbound, constituting a collection of objects to be handled rather than mere pages to be turned. End quote. As such, they demarcated a space to be collectively filled with contributions by various artists and writers, and dispersed across all the contributors, the cost and labor of production. Univers is a notable example of this, and also something of an anomaly amongst the magazines mentioned here, as it began publication in 1987 and continued after the fall of the Berlin Wall all the way to 1995. As the galactic scope of its name suggests, Univers perhaps most fully represents a more international frame within which to consider the East German alternative publications. The editors for the early issues are Gregorio Berchenko, Ulrich Thaler, Jörg Kowalski, and Guillermo Deisler. Deisler, who made his way to Halle from Chile via France and Bulgaria, was the main progenitor of this project, and it is to his address that potential contributors were instructed to send submissions. And I just want to quickly plug here the work of Felipe Becerra at Columbia, who has a chapter of his forthcoming dissertation dedicated to Deisler titled Revolucionar el Medio, Obsolescence, Handcraft, and Consumer Culture in Guillermo Deisler's Ediciones Membre. And Felipe has been very kind in talking to me about Deisler, so I'm looking forward to his dissertation. Active at the tail end of the movement, Univers fits within the Fluxus mail art networks of exchange between Latin America and Central Europe. Described as a portfolio, each issue features the work of approximately 40 artists. The unbound contents were typically packaged in a carton casing, sometimes evoking the archival box, with a collage cover and bound in twine, though there are some variations, as in the first issue, which was tucked into brown paper and sealed at the top with metal brads. Potential contributors to a particular issue were instructed to send 100 distinct copies of their work to Deisler for inclusion. Submissions typically came from Europe, but others hailed from Latin America, the United States, Australia, and Japan, for instance. As already referenced, there are a significant number of publications that display a diverse and economical variety of materials, printing methods, and so forth that indicate what was on hand for artists at the time. Covers of Anschlag were variously made from sandpaper, vinyl, and even, as pictured here, a grillkorb, which was used for cooking fish. And another magazine, Der Schaden, likewise employs twine, glued in film negatives, and text typed on a typewriter and then reproduced by Xerox copy, or typed on tissue paper with carbon paper sandwiched in between to enable multiple copies to be produced at once, Samizdat style, as in the case of this poem by the artist Cornelia Schleimer. To come back round to Weghorst and her role as a key documentarian of the production of art in the GDR, at the back of the 14th and final issue of Der Schaden, a photograph by her collectively documents all the covers of issues 1 through 12. As a Bilddokumentation, or a picture documentation of the magazine, it creates an archival capsule of the magazine's production over the years. And today, the covers and full content of Der Schaden are further preserved thanks to a major digitization initiative of the SLUB with the Deutsche Photothek. In fact, all the magazines shown here and discussed here, with the exception of Univers, are publicly accessible online. A total of 24 alternative artist magazines in the library's collection have been digitized, and we have a link to that we can drop in the chat. Each scanned page can be viewed individually, along with the metadata that credits the artist or author, provides information about medium, which is especially important in these magazines that employ so many different printing methods, dimensions, dates, and so forth. Clicking through this collection quickly provides the viewer with a sense of the diversity of materials used in creating the publication. And while I've spoken previously about the concurrent need for removing barriers to physical access to archival and library spaces, in our current moment, the pandemic truly does make these digitization projects all the more essential. I hope, though, that this is not at the cost of further limiting access to study collections at libraries, universities, and museums once it becomes safe to gather in person again, as these institutions have often already served a function of gatekeeping that does not always serve the intention of the people behind the works held therein, as well as interested publics in viewing the works. And to conclude, I want to briefly pose a contemporary and personal example of the ways in which I engage the questions raised here as a small press editor myself. And our next panelist, Sherese Francis, is also a board member and editor. Harlequin Creature, since its inception in 2011, actually employs many of the DIY production methods highlighted in this talk, although no grillkorb as of yet for cover, and is steadfastly committed to the material, non-digital form. Something I've termed avant-garde and retrograde, Harlequin Creature employs so-called obsolete technologies such as letterpress and risograph printing, as well as typewriters and carbon paper, and is produced in edition sizes of 100 copies, meant to showcase with love and care the work of the authors, poets, artists, and musicians we publish. What might be described as the radical inaccessibility of this project is intended, however, not to create a precious object accessible only at a high price point, but rather to ask the person who engages with these material forms to reflect on the haptic, experiential qualities exclusive to printed matter, and to thereby highlight the importance of slow work and offline community building within the digitally driven society in which we live. To do this, we rely on building relationships with libraries and librarians who collect our work, and thus hopefully make it further accessible and at no cost to others. In this way, I hope that Harlequin Creature follows in the legacy of publications such as those produced in the GDR, uncanny objects asking to be discovered and delighted upon when encountered in the archives. So thank you very much. I'll stop sharing my screen now and pass it on to Sherese.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to the Center for Book Arts for the invitation to be here today. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So today I'll be discussing community craft work, DIY publishing as a form of community building and resistance in the Cartonera movement and Broadside Press Black Power movement. And then later on, I'll talk about a little bit of my work that I do in my own community. So first, before I talk about Cartonera and Broadside Press, I wanted to look at the word craft. In my own artistic practice, I use etymology and definition as a kind of jumping board for deeper exploration of ideas. And so looking at the etymology of craft, it says that it means power, physical strength, and might. And then looking at the definition, one of the definitions, it's the skill in planning, making, or executing. And so craft has come to mean the ability or capacity to create or make something. And I think that's important in thinking about community and art. Another definition is the skill in deceiving to gain an end. And I think that goes along with the historical gendering of craft and its association with the demonization of women, especially when we think of witches and witchcraft, and how that gendering of craft controls the perception of craft in relationship to art. Another definition was the members of a trade or a trade association. And so that means a craft is associated with more of a community skill share collectivity instead of just an individual genius artist. The next one, a vehicle that can take us places like a spacecraft. And I was thinking of a conversation that I watched with Keisha Gay Anderson and Mariah Dessa Tali, two wonderful poets, and they were talking about the idea of craft and crafting as a vehicle that can take us to other places and other perceptions of who we are. And so overall, I wanted to think about uh, this kind of division in the art world of craft versus art, and how craft is seen as often as a less valuable form of art versus art that is considered so-called high art, and how that class division affects how we perceive art in general. And during the same talk with Keisha Gay Anderson and Mariah Dessa Karatali, I mentioned that craft could be seen as the idea of presence, of a full expression of the self, and that includes emotions, skills, capacities, your thought process, or just the engagement with the outer world and the materials of the world. So for Cartonera. So Cartonera is a publishing movement that began in Latin America. The first one was Eloisa Cartonera, which was founded in 2003 in Argentina. And Cartonera movement began as a result of the economic and environmental crises that were happening and are happening in Latin America. As the economies declined in these different nations, small businesses started to go bankrupt, and working class employees had less access to sources of income, which also uh, forced them to start looking for other means of gaining income, such as going through trash to find cardboard to sell for recycling. And it was through the start of Cartoneras that local poets and visual artists who were also impacted by the economic crises because small independent presses and local literary communities began to disappear as the price of paper increased, that they decided to start partnering with the Cartoneras to gain cardboard to be for the use of creation of books. Also, with the lack of, with the decline of the economy, there was a lack of institutional support and funding. So they had to find alternative ways to create funding. So they started to create more community-based ways of fundraising, such as providing printing services and literary workshops and skill shares. And through working with working class members of society, they also began to advocate for members of the lower and working class, for example, buying cardboard at least 5 times above the market price so that people could have living wages for themselves. And Cartonera also allowed the initiative allowed for engagement with older technology and familiar tools that everyday people could work with instead of more higher tech. And so it created a greater resourcefulness in terms of the materials one could use to create books. And this 5 years after the founding of the first Eloisa Cartonera, there was 8 other Cartoneras that were formed, and it kind of worked like they described as a rhizome where different root systems were popping up throughout Latin American countries. And now it has spread to over 300 new ones all across the world. And below you can see some of the Cartoneras that have formed all across Latin America. So here are some pictures of books that have been made by Cartoneras from across Latin America. And just looking at the covers of the books, you can see that there is a greater diversity of covers that can be made. And so this kind of initiative allows for greater individual expression when it comes to bookmaking rather than the traditional mass-produced literature that we consume every day. And it allows for more participatory style of art making as well that isn't just about consuming art, but allows for members of the community to participate in the products they are also consuming as well. So these are some additional books that have been made in different Cartoneras. Dulcinea Catadora is one in Brazil, and La Cartonera is one in Mexico. So some lessons I've learned from Cartonera that have impacted my own work is one, sustainability and resourcefulness. By relying on recycled materials, it brings into question concepts of disposability, as well as in using older tools, it questions the idea of obsolescence when it comes to technology that we engage with every day. And also, it's not about just material disposability, but also social disposability when we think of lower class and working class people, that as the economy suffers, lower and working class people are usually the first to suffer and the first to be seen as disposable. And so in initiatives like this, it allows the transformation of material and social purposes. So another lesson I learned was Cartonera is responsive to local communities' social, cultural, and economic realities. By having kind of grassroots operations within communities, it allows for a more immediate actions and responses to what's happening within the actual communities. and the work is also representative of what's happening in the communities. It allows for interdisciplinary practices in that literature is now collaborating with other forms of media, such as visual arts and bookmaking. It allows for a skill share in that members of the community can come together and work with each other and share each other's skills and at a low cost. And it doesn't take a lot of money to invest in when the community is coming together to share with each other. And another lesson I learned was art and technology is seen as relational, not as technology that is for advancement or progress in terms of profit motives, but technology that allows one to engage with the materials and the outer world as a collective resource for creation. And another lesson I learned was literary is that Cartonera provided literary, artistic, and cultural diversity and agency by having a initiative that wasn't based around marketability and a market system, but instead around community. It allows for a greater number of people and voices that can express themselves in the publishing initiative, and that includes race, gender, class, um, LGBTQ communities. It's open to whatever. And some of the books that have been created include sex workers and prison populations. There's works that are created in various local languages instead of standardized languages. And they've even created works with poetic experimental languages that they've created with the community. And finally, Cartonera, as I mentioned before, is not subjected to the demands of the market or mainstream. And that allows for the questioning of value, like who determines value? Is it the people in power, or is it the community and the grassroots level that determines what is valuable overall? Next, we have Broadside Press. And Broadside Press was created by Dudley Randall, who was a former librarian in 1965, and it lasted to around 1977. Later on, Broadside Press joined with Lotus Press, and now today they are known as Broadside Lotus Press. Similar to Cartonera, they also provided printing services and published cards, books and pamphlets. Randall was known for taking well-known poems that were circulated throughout the Black community and publishing those poems because he knew that there was already a ready-made audience for those works. His first anthology of 6 broadsides was known as The Poems of the Negro Revolt, and it include works from Dudley Randall himself, Gwendolyn Brooks, Robert Hayden, Melvin Tolson, Margaret Walker, and Haki Madhubuti, who is then known as Don L. Lee. He also published other works from Alice Walker, Etheridge Knight, Audre Lorde, Amiri Baraka, Nikki Giovanni, and Sonia Sanchez, and addressed subjects that range from Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, Black Power movement, the women's movement, and other revolutionary politics. So I wanted to read a quote from Dudley Randall in which he discusses his purposes behind Broadside Press and how he managed and run the press. He said, "I believe poetry should cover a broad range. I didn't want to censor the poets. I may have disagreed with some of the things they said in their poetry, but I wouldn't let it go because I don't believe in censorship. But I would let it go because I don't believe in censorship. I believe that a poet has to write as he or she wants to write and not as they are told. As long as the poetry moved me or other people, it could be published. I would accept poets or on whether I like the poetry, not so much on their political stances, but on what I thought was their ability as poets. Broadside Press has not been subsidized or funded by any individual organization, foundation, or government agency. It has been, and always will be free and independent. It is a free Black institution. Support for the press has come from the grassroots, from poets who donated their poems to the anthology for Malcolm in honor of Malcolm, from the poets in the first group of the Broadside series who steadfastly refused payment for their poems, from the many persons who subscribed in advance for the Broadside series and the anthologies so that they could be printed, and from others who donated sums above their subscriptions. It is the poets and the people who have supported Broadside Press. I've declined partnerships, mergers, and incorporation as I wanted freedom and flexibility of action, wanted to devote the press to poetry, and am afraid that stockholders in a corporation would demand profits and would lower quality or go into prose in order to obtain profits. Income from the press goes into publishing new books in an attractive and inexpensive format. I pay royalties to the other poets, but royalties on my own books go back into the press. I'm not against royalties for myself or profits for the company if they ever come, but I am more interested in publishing good poetry. So Randall's avoidance of institutional support, which was either corporations or government, allowed for freer expression from the poets and allowed him to publish whatever kinds of works that he felt deserved to be out in the world. And this was especially important during the Black Power, Black Arts movement, where a lot of the views of the poets could be seen as controversial and not palatable to a mainstream white audience. So these were some of the broadsides that Randall published. The first one, of course, is from Randall himself, and the Ballad of Birmingham was inspired by the Birmingham bombings the Birmingham church bombings that murdered 4 little Black girls in the 60s. So as you can see, these broadsides look like conventional broadsides, but because Randall had control over his own press, he was also allowed to experiment in other ways. As you can see in these set of broadsides, the first one is We Real Cool by Gwendolyn Brooks. And as you can see in this broadside, Randall inverted the conventional printing aesthetic of black ink or colored ink on white paper, and instead covered the entire page in ink and let the negative space turn into the text. He also made the body of the text larger than the title and the name of the poet. And the way the poem is structured, it emphasizes the we at the end, which represents a lot of Black community ideas around the idea of community and collectivity. And the next piece from James A. Emanuel shows also this kind of experimentation with typography, in that the text looks like something that has been quickly scribbled, and it matches the what's going on in the poem, as it's this kind of chaotic scene that's happening in the poem. And then the next one is the card cover for the Ballad of Birmingham. And this cover is actually inspired by traditional elegiac covers for broadside covers for funerals. So he was taking inspiration from older aesthetics as well. And speaking of older aesthetics, in this Gabrielle broadside by Robert Hayden, you see that Randall uses illuminated text that's used in from like middle ages bookmaking to kind of represent this like sacred text of this poem. And these were some books that were published under Broadside Press. This one's from Gwendolyn Brooks called Riot. And this was around the time that Gwendolyn Brooks became more outwardly political in her work, and she felt that Broadside Press was the great place for that kind of work to be published under. And another book here is We Are Bad People by Sonia Sanchez. So some lessons from Broadside Press that inspired my work is that it was allowed to be an institution that was culturally and socially responsive. It was geared towards more the cultural expressions of the Black community and not a more middle class, upper class, mainstream, whiter audience. And so through that, it was allowed to prioritize the voices of those who are more socially marginalized, such as Black, Indigenous people of color, LGBTQ community, the poor, and working class. And also the aesthetic itself of the various broadsides and books were allowed to be culturally relevant as well, instead of a more conventional printing style. Another lesson I learned was from Broadside Press was that they could prioritize art that is functional instead of art for art's sake, which is art that is devoid of any moral or political messaging, or art that reinforces a status quo or is more profit driven. Instead, they could create art that's about spreading important information and messages and is geared towards social change. And they could also create art pieces and broadsides that were about a shared cultural experience and that was more reflective of a community and didn't need to be appealing to a wider, more massive audience. And also the work was more affordable and accessible. A lot of the works were either 50 cents or $1, and so lower and working class people could afford to take part in these literary cultures. And Randall also wanted the work to be a part of daily material practice, meaning that a person could take a broadside and fold it up and put it in their pocket or put it in their wallet, and they can use it whenever they want instead of it being archived away and not easily accessible to everybody. And the last thing is that it challenged liberal, neoliberal ideas of free market and humanism, or a generalized humanity. Uh, Ideas around free market ignore that a market system is structured to favor the demands of a mostly middle to upper class, white, cis, hetero, male audience. And so a free market doesn't really work if those issues aren't addressed. And the same goes with ideas around humanism, when traditionally the norm of what is human has been conceived around the idea of white and male. And I use this quote from Lewis Simpson, who is a poet and literary critic, in how he discussed Gwendolyn Brooks' selected poems in 1963. And his quote shows you not in only that he uses the pronoun he when Gwendolyn Brooks is a she, but also that for Lewis Simpson, the idea of racial and cultural experience is a hindrance to readability and marketability. So as for my work, so what I've learned from Cartonera and Broadside Press was to emphasize local and literary as well as book expressions and art forms, especially because they're often ignored in a globalized market and a corporate controlled market. So in my work, the first thing I want to talk about is J Expressions, which I formed in 2016 while I was working for Queen's Book Festival. And I formed that because in my neighborhood of Southeast Queens in New York City, there isn't much literary platforms or bookstores in Queens for for writers, authors, and artists to uh, showcase their work. So I wanted to create something that showcased the books and works of writers and authors in my community. So I took the books that I had collected from my work at Queen's Book Festival and created a mobile library of those books. And since then, I've been expanding the collection and doing pop-ups around my community, sharing the books that come from the uh, the poets, writers, authors who are already living within my community. The next work I participated in was the Southeast Queens Artists Alliance Zine Library. In 2018, the Artists Alliance created a cart festival that we did in the park. And so we wanted to extend that project. So we decided to create a cart ourselves. And one of the members, Elizabeth Velasquez, actually created the cart herself. And we took the cart around our neighborhood in Southeast Queens to share zines that we collected from local writers and artists, as well as members of our community, just so that we could share the art that is happening in our community, because art is not well funded within our community as well. So we wanted to share all the artwork that's actually happening in Southeast Queens and all the artists who actually live in Southeast Queens. And besides sharing zines in the library, we also would teach zine and book making workshops because we wanted the community to be part of that art making process as well. The next work is a Harlequin Creature that Meghan mentioned earlier. I believe I joined in 2018 as a board member and then an editor. The main work I've done is with the social justice subscription series. And being an editor for Harlequin Creature has allowed me to give a platform to local poets who may not have access to the publishing world in general. And it has also allowed for innovative works, like, for example, Yasmin Lancaster recently published the Substitute Teacher Chronicles, which were her series of posts on Facebook in which it was kind of a diary of her talking about her experiences working as a substitute teacher. And we took her Facebook posts and turned them into an actual book. The next work I've done is the Jam Journal, which I started last year. And that is a digital platform that I wanted to create as a way for writers and other kinds of artists to collaborate and work with each other to create new, innovative, experimental kind of works. And I just want that to be a kind of platform for experimentation and for the community to really have a platform to express themselves. And finally, I also facilitate poetry and bookmaking workshops. And that goes back to what I was talking about in terms of craft work and teaching people that they have the capacity to make their own books and literary work within their communities and to validate their own work within their communities, even if they may not have access to larger publishing platforms. So these are some pictures of what I do. The above picture on the left side is from the Cart Festival, in which I was doing bookmaking classes with young people in the park at the Cart Festival. Next to it is the first selection of books I had in the mobile library. Below the Cart Festival picture is the logo I created for the Jam Journal. Next to it is one of the books in the social justice subscription series. from Damali Abrams, the Glitter Priestess Recipe Zine. And I mentioned Damali because she has appeared in all three of the projects that are here in the Jam Journal, in Harlequin Creatures publications, and she's also a member of the Southeast Queens Artists Alliance. And you can see her book on the cart itself on the left here. Yeah. And that is it. And I like to thank you all for listening to my presentation. These are the sources of what I used for the presentation. And if you would like to find out more about my work, you can also find me at these links as well. Thank you. Stop share.
Thank you, Sherese. That was awesome. I was definitely taking notes, and we'll certainly be looking up some of these presses and websites that you mentioned because they sound awesome. I guess I'll get started on my little piece of this thing. Hold on one second while I share screen. All right. I'm going to keep my window in this format just because I have some clips of little videos and things that I would like to share. So thank you everyone for continuing to stay on to hear a little bit about the work that I do and that my sister does in supporting this Black Girls World Press. I would say we're a good example of a case study of what a current independent press in 2021 is doing, how we navigate the kinds of projects we want to work on, how we engage our audience, and how we sustain this business that we've been running now for about 8 years. I plan on positioning this conversation a lot on just where my head is right now, under the premise of the pandemic in 2021, and how things may have changed from years prior as we look at this creative practice that we've put together. And then I'm also very much thinking about and wanting to share, now that I'm older, where my head is as well. You know, my sister and I started this press in our early 20s. I'm not in my 20s anymore. So I have a different perspective on what we've done and what we're trying to do. So I'm gonna start it off with a little clip of Shirley Chisholm from my Instagram.
Oh, I think it's quite well known that I don't enter most things with the blessings of any party. I think it's quite well known. Anybody who's followed my political career knows very, very keenly that I am the only unbought and unbossed politician. And I mean that literally. And I think that you have to recognize that because I am not white and because I'm not a male, that I am not going to get the blessings of the power structure in this country. So I think we're fooling ourselves when that question is asked of me in terms of whether I'm going to get their blessings. Of course I'm not going to get their blessings.
Awesome, thank you. Hope everybody got a chance to hear that. Why am I showing you a clip of Shirley Chisholm? Because now that I'm a little older, the things I've been through in my own professional career and how I see my creative practice, I've really started to understand in the past few years. And this is before things like Kamala Harris being considered for VP had even come up. But for someone like me, I'm really starting to find that now that I'm later in my professional career, I'm really coming to terms with how the adversity that we experience as Black women professionals is not going to stop. The discrimination, microaggressions, just all the little nitpicky experiences that we have where people are kind of resisting our presence in the workplace, in an industry, at a concert, what have you, I've kind of reached that threshold where now I kind of get what Shirley was talking about as far as at this point in my life, anywhere I go and whatever I'm trying to do, I'm there because I want to be there. And I am not anticipating or expecting any welcoming energy in return because it doesn't matter anymore. It's a kind of leadership perspective that, all women don't necessarily hit. But as I think about people like Kamala Harris or Shirley Chisholm or any other women of color right now in a leadership position, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, it's like now I've reached that point in my career where I understand we're showing up anyway, and it does take a lot of energy to show up anyway, but it's because we have a desire and a passion to hit goals and certain aspirations that all this little drama, where people might not be comfortable with us being in that room, it just doesn't matter anymore. And so that's kind of where I'd like to start this conversation, having run this organization among others for a while now. I wanted to share a bit about my day job because I'm somebody with an interdisciplinary practice. I have my hands in a lot of pots. I have my hands in a lot of different activities that span genres, from live music, death metal, Scandinavian punk music, to classical opera, classical music. I play the violin, and then entrepreneurship, business development, leadership, all these things. And all of this influences what happens with the Black Girls World Press. So for example, I'm currently the director of all digital learning at the New School. Previously, I was leading online learning development at Sotheby's, New York Times, Columbia Business School. All of these gigs having something to do with exposing the sort of special information, the special knowledge that these institutions have, and bringing that information out online at lower prices in more accessible ways for more and more audience and public to have access to them in ways that they did not previously, right? So, that's what pays the bills. And it's important to me to share because what we're really carving out here is that we have multiple professions, as I'm sure many creatives on the call can relate to. Some of our professions might be further advanced or further along than some of our other interests, right? So I would say the day job is important because it's the source of most of the funding for things that we want to do with the independent press that my sister and I run. Now, secondary to that, we have, my creative practice and some of the entrepreneurship that I do. And I just think this is really important to share for anyone who's curious about how to create a sustainable creative practice where perhaps you don't want to rely so much on crowdfunding and donations and grants and scholarships and all that. And for me, as a person of color, as a woman of color, I have kind of a trigger around asking people for help or asking people for money because I'm just like, no, I have an idea. I want full control over how I roll out that idea. I'll be damned if I have to wait for a white man to tell me when he's decided to write me a check. That just don't sit well with me at all. So we're fully self-funded, my sister and I. And so edcircle.org is my consulting business where I offer online learning development. Now that I've kind of built up this practice and expertise in that space, I'm able to now bring in different clients in nonprofit, in higher ed, just in other industries and consult with them and help them continue to build out what they're trying to do online. And what I do is that's a very profitable business for me. So what we do is we take a significant portion of the profit we make from EdCircle and we push it into Black Girls World Press as well as another initiative I have started called the ACORL Leadership Institute for Women of Color. What I really enjoy about this way of funding is that with passion projects like Black Girls World and the Leadership Institute, I don't have to worry about market demand or audience demand, right? We can just really sit with the creative ideas that we have in mind, the vision of things we want to see, and just generate them and put them out into the world and not really worry so much about if either one of those organizations are revenue generating, because that's not the point of those two initiatives. Okay. So that's kind of where we are right now. A lot of my time, of course, is spent in the day job, which I like. I don't mind. I never minded having a day job in addition to my creative practice. Then we're running Ed Circle as well. Got money coming in through there. And then that allows us to do really cool, fun things that we enjoy with Black Girls World specifically. I will say though, like as I had mentioned Shirley Chisholm previously, the time I've spent in that professional realm with these day jobs and these companies have certainly triggered a very strong passion in me to help other women of color in their careers and professional spaces navigate the bullshit, because it's crazy out here. And as far as just, we know you have your credentials, your training, we know you're smart as professional women, and yet somehow, some way, you're still walking into spaces where you're getting a lot of resistance. And it's difficult keeping a job in 2021 with people testing your worth, testing your patience, testing your confidence, all those things. And so that's one of the reasons why I ended up starting this Leadership Institute. So I was like, I really want to address this. I can't be the only woman going through all these issues as I get higher and higher levels of leadership and responsibility. So there's that. So as I've shared, I've got all these different things going on, but I do feel like there's a consistent thread among all of them, be it creating online learning, digital learning initiatives, using technology, or press, using printing, using publishing, using the printed book, printed matter. Whatever it is we're up to, it's got something to do with empowering a specific community of people to claim some space for themselves and then provide them with the tools to implement these ideas that they have. So that could be, as far as Black Girls World, creating a space for women of color like my sister and I, who really do enjoy this aggressive, crazy, experimental metal music, and then saying to them, we're really honored that you like our zine, but you can also hang with us for a minute and we'll show you how to make your own zine. If you want to participate in any of these concepts you have on your own, you want to share your own voice, we're here to make space for that too. So that's something that's the biggest driver, I would say, to all the different activities that we're up to these days. And as I look back over the past decade, I can see that thread continuing, throughout these initiatives. So I'm going to switch over now to specifically getting into like the current activities of Black Girls World, especially if we have some new folks on the call who might not be familiar. I'm going to show you all a little clip of something that will, in my opinion, just sum it up nicely. Hey, that's good stuff right there. So that's a little clip of the daughter of this well-known musician performing, and I feel like that kind of sums up what Black Girls World is about, because people get confused sometimes. Sometimes they'll say we're some kind of punk press or punk organization. We're not punk, we're metal. And if there's a difference. And so that clip definitely just kind of summarizes where my sister and I spent most of our time before the pandemic. I was going to shows in New York weekly for years. That's our scene. It's crazy. It's fun. We like talking about it. If you haven't heard of Agretsuko, I highly recommend checking it out, because that's often the vibe that my sister and I will get from people. We're going to work every day in our little suits. People think we're like model minorities. Oh, these cute little Oreo girls or some shit like that. But it's like, no, see, when we leave this office, it's on. We get it turned up. We're going to this show, and it's 50 wild to be mosh pits and all this aggression. And one of the reasons I mentioned Agretsuko is because I can't deny that we also relate to struggling to navigate rage as women, rage and aggression, to say, does this society truly allow for a Black woman to be frustrated, pissed off, and angry in her own right? We often spend so much time navigating systems where they're waiting for us to have an attitude and they're waiting for us to flip out about something, that we don't actually get to express the true anger that we may be experiencing. And so I'm certainly a lifelong metalhead that would argue having a safe place to express your feelings is healthy. It's very healthy. And if that might have something to do with being in a mosh pit and knocking somebody's teeth out, that's no business. I'm not here to judge. Everybody came to the show with a similar understanding of what might occur. So it's like, yeah, creating a safe space for women to really resonate with how they want to express themselves is really great music. And then also just talk about their experiences in this community, in this space where this music happens. Because again, not always an easy space to be in. We're not always wanted, and we don't always care that we're not wanted. We're still going to show up because that's how much we care about the music. Is this good music? Does it sound good? So yeah, that's the vibe of Black Girls World. And so we create all these different things to support the shared experience that women like us are having in that space, in that environment. Before the pandemic, we were on track to go beyond this very first punk fest and zine fair that we launched in Philadelphia at the Institute of Contemporary Art in 2019. As my sister has spent a solid 12 months putting that event together, researching bands, putting things together to really launch an extensive 2-day festival where we had panel talks and workshops and all the stuff. And as we put that event together in 2019, everyone we spoke to was just like, well, you're going to do this again, right? Like, you're going to do this like on a recurring basis, right? And you can't just do this on the East Coast. Like, you coming to the West Coast too, right? What's gonna happen in the future? So I will say, we had definitely planned on spending this year working at least towards a West Coast event where, it has to be a live event with women fronted metal bands. Also, for the record, I let the museum call this a punk fest because I didn't want to scare them with the kind of bands we had actually booked. So I was like, yeah, punk fest, sure. But in reality, it was a lot more diverse than that, and people were really able to experiment and show their best musical talent in all these other ways. But yeah, anyway, so as part of Black Girls World, we're really big on just bringing people together when we can help it. We try not, as organizers, to put ourselves front and center. But depending on, the situation of the day, sometimes like me as the creative director, I end up being the model for everything and very, very much front and center. But in the future, as soon as things look better, we absolutely want to get back into more live events where these young kids can truly have a space to come together and geek out about all these things that they enjoy. And again, that would probably be self-funded. It's just us using our own money to put it together. These are some shots of some of the books we've made over the past. A lot of Rezo, a lot of like low cost productions, because I have been that thing. I know how to make fancy shit. That wasn't really the point with Black Girls World. We wanted to make publications and editions of things that teenagers with very little pocket money could grab. So for many years, we really tried to stay under like $12 to $15 per book, or we would have like 50-cent or $1 stickers, just very much like the whole point of what we had been putting together was to celebrate the younger kids of color who were curious about trying all this different music, checking out the scene, but might have been feeling some discouragement that they weren't, welcome in those spaces. And then later on, we started to produce some higher quality editions that were generally meant to be, I would say, like one-off special editions, right? Like not our regular stuff. But it just depends on like what we have access to after a certain point, especially with the lockdown and everything. Some of our works become, I would say, a lot more glossy just because we have easier access to that kind of printing shop than we might have to some of the other shops that were doing Rezo and other cooler methods of printing. But in the future, like as soon as like a month from now, we're hoping to release like some things that are a little more reminiscent of the lower cost items we used to produce. And then the other thing I would say is Black Girls World, for the most part, was an in-person initiative, right? Like, I'm somebody who's been part of the New York City zine community for about 7 years now. So then the other thing too was we were very used to just having a schedule of going to weekly or monthly zine fairs, artist book fairs. I'm sure you all know. And without that direct contact of just showing up with a stack of books and handing them out, what we've been working on for this year is like this full e-commerce transition to, okay, what are we trying to do online? And really like approach this online thing seriously. I've done it for my other businesses, but I hadn't really wanted to do it for Black Girls World necessarily. So that's kind of a new space for us. And as we're also interested in still trying to have some kind of touch point with, again, the younger audience that where, we might have just been at an event in their neighborhood and they were able to come by with $3 or $4 and get something from us. So it's a little different, definitely different now. But yeah, please let me know if you guys have any questions. I'm going to close it out here by saying we're always coming up with new merch, new books, new publications, and just new ways for people to rock their personal style and their personal expression. But yes, this thus closes out what I had wanted to share about Black Girls World. Mm-hmm. I think we're going to do Q&A now. Yes.
Yeah, I think we can dive in
Yeah.
with Q&A.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, first of all, so much for three terrific presentations. And there's definitely been lots of enthusiasm in the chat window and otherwise. So so thank you very much. Maybe to kick things off, Maddie Rosenberg had made both a comment and question, I think, about how to some extent you're all talking about the need to navigate the system while creating an alternative one. And in particular, how with the work that's being created, whether in the GDR in the 80s or perhaps or certainly in the present situation, we are able to fund, to distribute, in a sustainable way, the kind of material and work that you're talking about. And so I think there was an interest in perhaps hearing some more discussion about, both kind of operating in this mode of both in some ways within the system and creating an alternative one, but also how this becomes a sustainable, fundable model, and maybe how you distribute and get these things out there. I think we heard a lot about that already, but perhaps there's a little more to say. If any of you want to.
Maybe we can.
I can respond if that's okay. I mean, I'm somebody who would, I would argue that I'm a big fan of taking power from one institution to put it into another institution. And I don't know, I think for me, I just never had, I think for me, it's like, the world already got enough issues with us and what we trying to do. I don't want to ask them for their support at this point. I want to do it myself. I don't even want to hear from them. And what little spin on it they want to add. And everybody approaches this completely differently, so there's a big space for that. But I think for me, I'm just like, I really like books like Company of One. I'm gonna put this in the chat. I've been reading this book called Company of One, and it talks about, running a business at the scale that you want to run the business. So not just trying to start a business and being like, oh yeah, we're gonna be the next Amazon. That's what I want to see. Everybody that launches a business don't necessarily want to be Amazon. Like people look at their own budget, their own lifestyle, and you can approach business generation as, I just wanted to put a little something together that might pay my rent for the next 5 years. That's it. I ain't trying to blow up. I'm not trying to take out the MoMA. I ain't trying to do all that. I don't need So I think creatives have to navigate that for themselves. Like when you say you want to make an impact, what does that mean? If you just make an impact in your local community, can't that be enough? If you want to take on the whole world, great. But don't stress yourself out. Start small.
Yeah, I agree with Christina. I believe small is just as important. For me, I rely on a mixed set of resources for funding. Sometimes I apply for grants for more formal projects. If it's a more like personal project or a smaller scale project, I usually rely on my own funding or funding I gain from other resources like selling my own personal products or my Patreon. I believe there's always funding that you can use for a personal passion projects. And for me, this is my personal passion projects. And again, agreeing with Christina, like keeping it small, like it doesn't have to be on a large scale. It's still impactful, even if it's in a small community.
Yeah, and I just want to add that also really resonates with me and what we do with Harlequin Creature. We make editions of 100. It's not to reach large audiences through purchases, even, and we try to keep also like them sold at a small price point and hope that they also end up in institutions. And that's where then that sort of tension comes in, I guess, like where and that's why I think the archive is I see there's a question about that, like where the archive is sort of a kind of, for me, an evocative place to look at this tension between the project that you're making on your own and the institutions that may or may not choose to collect them, fund them, etc. And why I think it's really important to address gaps in the archive, but also at the same time acknowledge that the archive itself is a potential mode of exclusion. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Actually, there's quite a number of questions that came up around different facets of the archiving process, and so that might be something to explore a little bit more. And some of it ranges to, I think you just touched on some of the points, but on the one hand, what do you collectively do as people sort of facilitating the making of work to think about preserving this work in archives? Some of the balance perhaps between the ethics of how or consent to having it archived and how it's described, and perhaps also looking at some of the German material around the need to contextualize or even interpret some of the material, but also the questions of access. On the one hand, the positive of making this material more accessible, but also how do we ensure that it truly is something that people feel welcome to in a wider case beyond an academic environment? So a lot of intertwined questions, but maybe if Meghan, if you want to start, but in general, sort of thinking about these different facets of archiving this kind of material and making it understandable and accessible.
Maybe I'll just briefly give a concrete example that I was thinking through with this project, and then pass it on to Sherese, since you also have a pop-up library. With the Sloop in Dresden, so these items were collected in the 80s, but then they were, as I briefly mentioned, very limited in who could have access to them before 1989. But then after 1989, there was access limitations, because then they were treated as sort of scarce and precious materials that if there was so much interest in looking through them, that would cause damage to these publications. So then they were digitized, but then that creates this issue where it enables there to be further limitations to who can go visit them, because you can say, oh, they're online. So that was sort of the tension that I was thinking of in that specific case with the collection at the Sloop. And then I'll pass it on to Sherese.
Yeah, so for my mobile library, it stresses for me the importance of community archives, not always relying on institutions to archive our work. And I get that institutions have more resources to do archiving, but everybody in their own homes has collections of things. I have hundreds of books in my own house. So I think it's just the importance of community archiving, community sharing, that's more important than, having materials that are put away somewhere that are rarely accessed by anybody. The more information is spread throughout communities, I think that is a more important thing to keep our societies in conversation with one another, not, preserving to the point that it's locked away somewhere.
I was just gonna say quickly, I remember a few years back at some of the zine events, like I'd say 2016, 2017, here around Brooklyn, just tabling at little fairs, and then having like these curators and librarians from really big institutions just come in to the space and try and buy out every table and all their inventory, right? So like someone would just come up and be like, I'll give you $50 if I can have the whole box of all the zines you've made. And I remember even at that time, I was like, no, like I made this for the kids. You don't look like a kid. And why do you need the whole box? Like, what are you trying to do? Like, what is the story here? So I don't know. I kind of get the impression that some librarians and archivists have calmed down since that time, or perhaps I've been checked a few times, hashtag Whitney. But, it seems like things are getting a little better. I could be wrong. Somebody please counter me if I'm off base about this. But I do remember some tension here, at least in the New York City area, around this talk of archiving, but then also like the power dynamics of that. Like, you ran off with all my books for $5. You had a budget of like $500 a minute. So just all of that. Yeah.
Sherese, you touched on it again, but I think there was some interest in maybe hearing a little bit more about the zine museum and library experience and kind of sort of how that, perhaps where it's going even further. But I think there was some interest in maybe hearing a little bit more about your experience with that.
Yeah, so with the zine library, because it was a new project within our community, a lot of people in the community were they were curious, but also kind of staying away sometimes because they weren't sure whether they were allowed to touch the books or come near the books. And that's, again, what I was saying about when we teach people that things are so precious that you're not allowed to engage and interact with them. When communities have these kind of projects in their neighborhood, like our community in Southeast Queens in New York, we don't have a lot of public arts that happen there. And so when they see this thing, they don't know exactly what to do with it. So it was a great experiment in like, how do we engage communities who don't always have access to the arts, and how do we engage in a way that isn't about treating things that are so precious, but a way of sharing with each other and collaborating with each other and skill sharing that allows for innovation and flourishing of the minds and talent and creativity.
That's so beautiful. Can I add just something to that real quick?
Please.
With Harlequin Creature, we have that same problem where people can see that these are handmade objects and then don't want to touch them necessarily at tabling. And that's precisely the point, to have so many hands went into the making of the thing and then want more people to touch them too. And why I also think that these kinds of ephemeral projects that we've seen so many examples of today also push against the digital and challenge this notion of digitization as just like democratization and access, and at the risk of then making these spaces accessible and making sure that these books reach as many people as want to engage with them.
Sorry, I was just looking at something appearing in the in the chat, and I think it's more comment. But perhaps given some of the sort of overall theme, around either criticism or people sort of talking about or writing about some of the material, do you all think about any balance between, or even if there's a desire to have some of this material seen by people who could then sort of talk about it, write about it, either within communities or within sort of other spheres? And is there a way to sort of help make that happen that balances the challenges you were just talking about? Is there a desire to see some of these other environments sort of talk about, write about, access the work? And in light of the challenges you were just talking about a moment ago, how do you find that balance in terms of doing that, if it's even a desirable outcome?
I have a little 2 cents on this, if you all don't mind. Honestly, at this point in my life, it feels like any institution at this point who's trying to diversify whatever they're up to in a way they haven't done before, at this point, they need the same kind of approach that they would take in their hiring practices. Otherwise, they just they mess it up. As far as, like I've participated in art book events where the target audience we're trying to serve is not there. And I might not know that ahead of time, what have you, but I'm there. The people that I'm trying to serve are not there. And the folks that are present are exoticizing us. They're walking by our table and literally saying, wow, Black girls who like metal, that's the oddest thing I've ever heard in my life. Let me go ahead and buy a book. And it's like, I don't know if I want to sell you a book right now, because you're communicating to me that it's the strangeness of it, or the weirdness of it that is attracting you to it. That's not why we came out here. We came out here to celebrate. So when I think of institutions who might have this, like, what an odd, strange thing I'd like to collect. It's like, okay, I can see you all saying that about some of your Black staff too. So that's my 2 cents on it. I think everything is like a process, has to be developed with intention. And yeah, it's a process. It's a process. Whew.
Yeah, I just want to agree with Christina that I think it's more important to have the people within the community talk about their work and not necessarily have someone outside of the community come in and they're not aware of the nuances or the specificities of that particular community. And so it's easier to mischaracterize certain aspects or spread misinformation. And that wasn't the intended purpose of what a group or community was trying to do. So I think it's important to hear the voices that are in those communities first.
I know we're just about running out of time. We can, since there's going to be another session following on, which I encourage people to attend in a few minutes, we can continue the chat on the PMBABF CABC chat site, and I'm putting that link in if people want to.
Sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to let you all know that I just made a Zoom room. So if you guys want to continue the conversation, and if people from the audience want to jump in there and have a more personal conversation that's not live streamed, not recorded, you guys can go here. I'm dropping it in the chat right now.
Okay, I am going to wrap up the recording of this session now. The room will stay live. I'm just going to sort of wrap up the recording part in case anyone wants to make any final comments.
Okay, thank you.
But thank you very much. And again, this has been, I think, a great continuation of the discussions. And if people want to continue in either of those forums, they are free to. I'm trying to, it's the other comments are scrolling by quickly, but if you scroll up a little bit, you'll get to the Zoom room that Karina was just mentioning. So thank you all very much. Again, we'll leave this open so that things don't disappear for a few more minutes. But otherwise, we'll leave all of those options open. And thank you for the terrific conversation.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Christine. Thanks, Sherese.